What if I told you the real Ollie never actually died and might still be somewhere in the factory? Now I know that sounds crazy, but if we take a closer look at the evidence I found, there's a strong case for it. Not only does it suggest that Ollie survived, but it also hints that he could play a major role in Chapter 5. Let's start with the obvious. The prototype spent an excessive amount of time mimicking Ollie's voice, which initially led me to believe that Ollie was nothing more than a non-existent child created by the prototype as a way to deceive us and Poppy. However, this assumption didn't turn out to be correct. Ollie was in fact a real person, most likely a child based on everything we know so far, and it seems to be that he is long gone.
Yes, there was.
But that was a very long time ago.
It's also important to recognize a crucial pattern. The prototype tends to only mimic the voices of Playtime co-employees, all of whom were killed. This strongly suggests that anyone whose copies is already dead. So if that's the case, why would Ollie be the one exception? To answer this, we need to break down all the hints we've been given. By carefully piecing them together, we can form a solid conclusion about Ollie's fate and examine why his potential survival even matters to the story. For a rather simple theory, if you go out of bounds in Chapter 3, you can actually discover an unreachable area labeled in developers text as Ollie's room. This strongly indicates that Ollie was an orphan living in Playcare before the factory shut down. And here's where things get really interesting. If we look at a VHS tape from Chapter 3, it heavily implies that the orphans were not among the victims of the toy massacre.
Are they in the same place as the employees?
No.
Are the children safe?
Yes.
Can I see them?
No.
This is then confirmed later in Chapter 4, where Poppy informs us that the children are below in the labs, and if this theory holds true, it would mean Ollie is still alive, alongside the other surviving orphans. But if that's the case, why would the prototype, out of all possible voices, specifically choose to mimic his? It seems that the prototype can only mimic the voices of those he spends significant time with, and this wouldn't be the first instance of him forming a close bond with a particular child. After all, he once secretly collaborated with an orphan named Theodore Graham Bell, working alongside him to escape the facility, communicating with him in secrecy while everyone else remained completely unaware. Perhaps Ollie and the prototype had also spent a great deal of time together at some point, making Ollie's voice the most convenient one to imitate. But what if the truth behind Ollie's fate isn't as simple as that? If you recall, during Chapter 3's first nightmare sequence, multiple radios were scattered across the never-ending hallway of Home Sweet Home, revealing details about a deeply disturbing discovery at Elliot Ludwig's estate.
Local authorities report that the body of a young boy has been found on the estate of the late Elliot Ludwig, an esteemed toy maker and originator of the Playtime company.
In the actual game, these gruesome details were primarily used to enhance the nightmare sequence atmosphere, but the lore itself seems significant, and here is where things take a dark turn. I personally believe that the deceased child mentioned in these radios was Ollie himself. At first, this may sound like a far-fetched theory, but there's actually a substantial amount of evidence supporting this idea. More importantly, it could explain how Ollie is still present in Playtime Co. during the events of the game. For starters, we need to look into the possibility that Elliot Ludwig and the prototype are one and the same. I know that Chapter 4 might seem to contradict this idea. It confirms that Poppy is Elliot Ludwig's daughter.
I wish you were here, Dad. When you were running this place, you always knew what to say. I miss you.
Yet it's stated in the same tape that she hates the prototype. This should seemingly prove that Ludwig and the prototype are not the same entity, unless Poppy doesn't simply realize that they are. There is also an issue where Ludwig can be heard in a tape where the Doctor is being turned into an experiment.
Who gave you the order? You spineless cowards! After all I've done for this project, for this company!
I gave the order, Sawyer.
Peer.
And this comes years after the prototype was first developed, but that's a story for a different day. And while some might argue that Poppy knew her father well enough to recognize that kind and caring man like him couldn't possibly be the same person inhibiting the murderous prototype, however, we don't actually have concrete proof yet that Ludwig was as good-hearted as she might believe him to be. In fact, there's some strongly unsettling evidence that suggests otherwise. The orientation notebook heavily implies that every Poppy doll sold back in the 1950s was made using human parts. Ludwig was very much alive at this time. It's hard to believe that he wasn't involved in such horrific practices, especially considering how suspicious it is that he had Playcare built deep underground, hidden from plain sight. It raises the question, was Ludwig really the loving man that everyone believed him to be? And just because Ludwig might have been evil, figures don't necessarily mean he was incapable of being a decent father. Considering the VHS tape from chapter 4, the one where Ollie is heard confronting Poppy while she's suffering from a traumatic episode.
No, I'm scared. Ollie, is that what you want to hear? I'm scared, and I'm angry, and I really don't know what to do.
At this point, we still don't know whether the Ollie in that tape was the real one or simply the prototype imitating him. But if it was the prototype and Ludwig is truly his identity, then this moment could prove that despite everything, he still genuinely cares about his daughter. This still leaves two major questions unanswered though. If Ludwig as the prototype truly cares for his daughter, then why would he want to lock her up inside a cage? And if Ollie was the corpse found at Ludwig's home, wouldn't that mean he's officially dead? For the first mystery, there's a strong possibility that Ludwig was simply trying to protect his daughter. Yes, his speech at the end of chapter 4 certainly gives off the vibe of a typical villain, but there are moments where he doesn't seem purely evil, where his words feel more personal than anything. Almost as if he is trying to justify his actions, specifically to Poppy rather than anyone else, to suggest that beneath all of his terrifying actions, there may still be a lingering sense of fatherly care, a belief that keeping Poppy contained was in some twisted way for her own good, not to mention that according to the orientation notebook, Poppy lived in her case while Ludwig was still a human. And it's literally Poppy's case that the prototype refers to as her home. Now, as for the possibility that Ollie isn't actually dead, let's take another look at the deceased child found at Ludwig's estate. A likely possibility is that the doctor, Harley Sawyer, was the one who planted this corpse in order to frame Ludwig. We already know that Ludwig and Sawyer had serious bad blood between them, stemming from the fact that Ludwig personally removed Sawyer from the Young Genius program. This could have been Sawyer's way of getting revenge by setting Ludwig up to take the fall for something that he didn't actually do. Even if we assume Ludwig was a bad guy, which is the perspective we're following for the theory, it still doesn't really add up for him to have murdered a child by the time Ludwig presumably became the prototype. And assuming Ludwig was already against the experiments happening within Playtime, which is exactly why he orchestrated the Hour of Joy, sure, he may have been involved in using human organs for the Poppy dolls back in the day, but at some point his perspective shifted. This possible change of heart can actually be traced back to a letter Ludwig wrote when removing Sawyer from the program. In it, he mentioned that he had changed after truly seeing the world again. Of course, this doesn't explain why he had Playcare built so deep underground, but that's a mystery for another time. Of course, Sawyer's main priority in life was science above all else. The corpse which we had previously theorized could have been Ollie was reported to be missing important components. These are the exact parts used to create the bigger body toys. This means Sawyer may have used Ollie not only as a means to frame Ludwig, but also as a test subject for some of his own twisted experiments at Playtime Co. And here's the most interesting part. If Ludwig is truly the prototype, he may not even be aware what's really happened to Ollie. This could explain why he simply assumes that Ollie is dead without considering any possible alternatives. So, what was the point of unveiling all of this? Well, if this theory holds up, it's very possible that we'll actually encounter Ollie as a bigger body experiment in Chapter 5. He might even give us a rundown of his backstory, revealing the truth about what really happened, and from there, join us in the fight against the prototype. It makes sense, as who would be okay with their voice being stolen and used without their permission? That could serve as his personal motivation to help us. If this is true, Ollie might become a third ally alongside Poppy and Kissy. If they return, that is. Do you think the real Ollie is alive? Drop your theories in the comments. Also, check out this video and subscribe.